Thank you so much.
Good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started, although there might be a few people filtering in with lunches. Welcome. My name is Sheila. I'm one of the hospital chaplains, and on behalf of Providence St. Vincent's Pastoral Services, I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Carol Taylor. It's nice to say I see some familiar faces from the morning, and it's nice to see some new faces. I think we're all in for a really wonderful presentation as Dr. Taylor continues some of the themes that she brought up in our morning lecture. But Dr. Taylor's visit is, we give thanks for her visit today. It's sponsored by Cinda and Jennifer Ng, who have generously provided support in bringing Dr. Taylor here. And over the series of lectures through the course of today and tomorrow, we will be having that opportunity to meet with Dr. Taylor. And she is here in memory of Dr. Frederick Ng. Dr. Ng, who specializes in anesthesiology, worked here at Providence St. Vincent's until his retirement in 1998. And Cinda and Jennifer are actually here in the office, in the audience today, and I'd like to invite you to join with me in thanking them for support of this lecture series. And I'd also like to extend much appreciation to the Center for Healthcare Ethics, who collaborated with Pastoral Services in organizing Dr. Taylor's visit. Dr. Taylor comes to us from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University, where she is Senior Research Scholar, Professor of Nursing and Ethics, and coordinates the Values-Based Healthcare Initiative at Georgetown. Dr. Taylor's career is quite distinguished. She is not only recognized for her depth of scholarship in nursing, ethics, and philosophy, but she also is noted for her excellent presentations and for her engaging presence. The response to her last visit in Portland in 2007, the response to that was overwhelmingly positive, with many, many requests to bring her back. But what is most notable about her work, and what I want to highlight, is that she has always been a strong advocacy for our moral obligation in keeping the welfare, the well-being of patients and families at the center of all of our interventions. Dr. Taylor not only recognizes the importance of clinical excellence and proficiency, but she also espouses the importance of keeping the traditional values that are at the heart of the healing profession, those of service and compassion. And given Dr. Ng's strong desire to care for others and his very holistic approach to patient care, it's fitting that Dr. Taylor's visit be offered in his memory. So in a moment, we will hear from Dr. Taylor, but before we do, I'd like to invite Barbara Siegel, Director of Programs at the Ethics Center, to lead us in a reflection this morning, or this afternoon.
Thanks, Sheila. Good afternoon. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to be co-hosting Carol Taylor again, to have her back, and also to be collaborating with Pastoral Services. I was reflecting this afternoon on our topic today, compassion fatigue, and kind of thinking about how do we support ourselves during this process. And with all the demands on our time and need to be dedicated and professional, but also to take care of ourselves. And I thought about a wonderful prayer, one of my favorites, by Ted Loder, and it's called "Gentle Me, Holy One." So I want to invite you just to take a minute and maybe go inside a little bit as I share this with you. Gentle me, Holy One, into an unclenched moment, a deep breath, a letting go of heavy experiences, of shriveling anxieties, of dead certainties, that softened by silence, surrounded by light, and open to the mystery, I may be found by wholeness, upheld by the unfathomable, entranced by the simple, and filled with the joy that is you. Welcome.
Thank you, Sheila and Barbara. What a great notion, the unclenched moment. Okay, so we come and we're in this time and space to enjoy our presence with one another, and with great gratitude to Cinda and Jennifer and to Dr. Ng for making this possible. So I think when I submitted this title, I actually called it Compassion Fatigue, Caregiver Burnout, and the Balanced Life. And your name? I'm sorry, you've got a mouthful. Julie. Julie was at the session this morning, and she said she was sent back this afternoon because somebody thought she needed to learn more about the balanced life. And I hope it's not a problem, but I've adapted the title a little bit to the first two terms and humane care, and you'll see why, I think, in a moment. So, don't mind the verbiage. Dosie and Dosie are, I think, a physician-nurse team that have talked a lot about the richness of our interactions with patients. And they quote Nightingale and Paracelsus. Nightingale saying, we're really not paying enough attention to the spiritual and psychological needs of patients. And they conclude with the statement that the richness of our clinical interactions, those human encounters, are what are often most instructive in bringing about the very health outcomes that we're trying to achieve. I oftentimes say to my medical and nursing students, when I talk about blended competencies, I said, today, obviously, we have to have intellectual capacity to pass our board exams and to stay current. You can't survive in today's healthcare arena if we're not technically competent, at the very least, be able to manage the technologies. What I think we take too often for granted is our interpersonal competence. And so what they're saying is we've got to pay attention to how we influence one another as collaborators in care, and certainly the patients, families, and communities that are entrusted to us. And they're talking about the importance of love, compassion, and empathy. And that's what I want to speak to. Treadway and Chatterjee was a medical student and a preceptor who were looking at why physicians oftentimes fail to pay sufficient attention to caring. And they say, and people actually oftentimes will pose this question to me. They'll say, can you teach someone to care? And what I loved about their insight, they said, I don't think it's a matter of teaching people to care. Most people, how many of you are healthcare professionals? How many of you came because you didn't know how or you didn't want to care? I mean, we're caring people, right? That's why we got into these professions. They said what we think happens is faculty preceptors and supervisors, by failing to pay attention to caring, beat that out of us. So if we think about the realities of practice today, if you're coming in for your annual performance evaluation, you're not usually asked to describe a critical moment when you became the critical difference for a patient and family because of the richness of your interactions. And I thought that was a really important insight. So I want to look at burnout and compassion fatigue and look at how we can help one another to do a better job with being that healing presence. Now I actually adapted the title to Humane Care because 2 months ago, when I was in Beirut, Lebanon at the American University, they challenged me to address this topic in ethics rounds. And we don't oftentimes talk about humane care. We talk about competent, compassionate care. When I looked it up, it's care that's marked by compassion, sympathy, or consideration. And you can have humane care of persons or humane care of animals. When I Googled the topic, almost nothing about humane care of people. Loads about humane care of animals. And it made, the title in Beirut was Humane Care, Trivial, Superficial, Unrealistic, or Essential. And I think we're no longer paying sufficient attention to whether or not the care that recipients of our services receive. This is a gentleman in an ICU bed. I don't think it would be a stretch for any of us to recollect an instance when people that we were providing care for received less than humane care. And there are times that we do things. And I always say, as members of health professions, our primary lens ought to be, how are humans affected by what we're doing? And if there's one thing that happens in healthcare, we very quickly accommodate. This is the way we do it here. Now, this is going to date me, but when I was first a young nursing faculty member, and we moved with students, so I was doing maternal child care, which was called obstetrics then, and a woman came in labor. We put husbands, and they weren't called partners then, in waiting rooms, and we whisked the women off to the labor and delivery room suites. We shot them up with Demerol and scopolamine so they wouldn't feel any pain. They developed dystocias, failure to progress. They couldn't push. We had vacuum extraction, suction deliveries. We put the babies right after birth in the nurseries under a light because the mothers weren't awake enough to hold them. And that was good obstetrical practice. We had medicalized childbirth. Humane or inhumane? Today, we have, because of more visionary people than me, multiple options for how to give childbirth, right? A lot of the natural methods, a lot more productive in terms of healthy moms and babies, especially in uncomplicated pregnancies. Now, you could take any piece of healthcare services and have the same. We do the same thing at the end of life, right? You're not dying well unless I'm jumping on your chest, God forbid. And it was the hospice movement that tried to question, was that type of a death always the right kind of death? So I think always a question for us in healthcare is what we're doing responsive to the dignity of humans, and have we adapted ways for one reason or another that are no longer achieving the very aims that we're trying to achieve. And that's if you could float over your practice area and look with that lens, are people better or worse because of what we're doing? What would we see? In geriatrics, I had students in long-term care in the days when a good resident was a safe resident. So you don't mind, doctor, if I slip this posy vest restraint over you and tie you into your chair so you don't fall. And the first time the patient or resident cried, it broke my heart. By the 5th time I'm slipping those vests over people and tying them tight, I was a good nurse doing my job and had lost my sensitivity to the cries of a human being restrained. And it took more sensitive people doing the research that showed we could keep an elder resident as safe in a restraint-free environment as tied with a posy vest into a chair or a bed. So this lens, I think, is absolutely huge. Now, this morning I referenced the Tino study. This is 2004, but I don't think we have made that much progress. And I referenced some of these numbers, but this is care of the dying. And this was a national study. 1 in 4 still didn't receive adequate pain management. Half of the patients, 1 in 2, did not receive enough emotional support. 1 in 4 expressed concern over the type of communication they were receiving about what was going on. Look at the 4th finding. 1/5, 21%, said the dying person was not always treated with respect. Now here at Providence, respect is one of your core virtues. It's one of your core values. I was doing a senior retreat once in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at a Mercy health system with their senior leadership. Their core value wasn't respect, it was reverence. And I said to senior leadership, tell me an example where you came to work recently and you were treated with respect. with reverence. And there was a stunning silence. I said, if this is a core value, examples should be dripping from your tongue. What did we say? Let me tell you what happened this morning when I came in. Let me tell you what happened last evening. Let me tell you what happened last week when we had this situation. A stunning silence. So I think a sobering question, how do we treat people with respect? And that's a reflection in and of itself. If we believe in inherent dignity, that we command respect from one another simply by virtue of being human, then we respect everybody. And you don't respect me because I'm standing at the podium speaking more than you respect me if I'm a kicker, biter, screamer with dementia, incontinent, and combative. You respect both because of their inherent dignity. Now, how we each do that, one of the most interesting consults that I got when I first started practicing as an ethicist was in the early days of AIDS. And the nurses on our AIDS unit called me, and they said, we had this gentleman, he was 42 years old, African American, with AIDS, but admitted with a cerebellar tumor. And they loved this man. He was engaging, but as the tumor progressed, he became violent. And after he had attacked a resident with an IV pole, and Haldol and pharmacologic management didn't control his behaviors, he ended up in 4-point leather restraints. And the nurses called the consult because they said, when we walk into his room, the image that comes to mind is an animal tethered to the bed. His sheets and gown would be awry. He had a Texas catheter for his for his urine, which he would pull off. His sheets would be urine soaked. And they said, it's just hard to think of him as a human being. And one of the new graduate nurses said, I discovered that he loves to be massaged. And she said, when I come into work in the morning, I wash him up and I warm some lotion. And she said, I massage him from the crown of his head down to his toes. And she said, I can feel his muscles relax. And it's my way of saying to him, you're a human being and I care. Now, my question to all of us is, how do we each demonstrate respect for those entrusted to our care, their family members, and for our team members? 1 in 3 said family members don't receive enough emotional support. So kind of sobering. Hopefully the statistics would be different if we did them here. Now, Dr. Lown, and this book is going back probably 30 years, and I think it's only more true today than it was when he wrote it, has this book called The Lost Art of Healing, and he talks about this Faustian bargain that medicine has completed. And he said, we have this 3,000-year-old tradition where there was this special bond between physicians and patients. And look at the bolded piece. He said, we've replaced that now, where healing is replaced with treating, caring supplanted by managing, and the art of listening taken over by technological procedures. Now, think about the lingo that we use. This I thought was interesting. He said, if we think about that patient interview where we would get to know the recipient of our care, he said, what we're teaching medical students today is that that patient interview is subjective, it's flabby, it's nothing like the hard numbers we get from a good ultrasound, from a good chemical panel. It's all about the numbers. It's not about listening to the patient or to the person. The patient has become a repository of malfunctioning organs or deranged regulatory systems that require some technical fix. I love this essay by this man with prostate cancer. I wouldn't demand a lot of my doctor's time. I just wish he would brood on my situation for about 5 minutes, that he would give me his whole mind just once, be bonded with me in a brief space, survey my soul as well as my flesh to get at my illness, because each of us is ill in our own way. And I love this. He said, I'd like my doctor to grope my spirit as well as my prostate. Now, when in your last experiences with a patient would they come away saying, Carol groped my spirit? I got a sense Julie really knew who I am. I was alive for that clinician. Now at Georgetown, we always said to our medical students, we put 2 paths in front of you. You can choose to be merely a technical expert, and you all have to do that in order to pass your board exams. Or you can be a technical expert and a humane healer. And what our hope is that you will value being a humane healer and pay attention to developing those skills. Now this was just a little piece, because compassion is so central to your mission, that I found on the BBC News magazine, where they talk about what it's reasonable to expect of today's clinicians. They said, it's not what you do, it's the way you do it that matters. So in the first 2 minutes that I walk into a clinical encounter, I communicate one of 3 messages. And it can be, drop dead, Jennifer. You're a miserable wretch, and my world would be better without you. Now, we don't often say that, right? Because we're way too professional. But I might say, Jennifer, here's your meds. And I'm treating you as a job to be done. You're an admission, you're a med, you're a discharge, you're a patient teaching. You're something I've got to check off on my to-do list today. But I'm not really interested in who you are. It's about getting the job done. It's a task versus a person orientation, or it's you're a person of worth and I care. And I do that in the first 2 minutes that I walk into a room. So people who tell me we don't have time to care, I may not have an hour to sit down and play beautiful music for you if I'm the one who's giving your meds. But I can, in the first 2 minutes that I'm there, communicate you're a human being and I care about you. I'm going to come back to in a moment why I think that matters. This was a lovely piece in JAMA, I think 2 years ago. And Amy Friedman is a physician who had GI problems. And she needed a colonoscopy. And she was a very private person and wanted no parts of that colonoscopy. And finally, her doctor said, we need to find out what's going on, and if you want to get better, you've got to go for the colonoscopy. So she kind of bundled up her privacy and her reserve, and she took herself to the endoscopic unit. And she said when she first got in there, everyone, beginning with the receptionist, was on cue, asked for the appropriate identifiers, was very proficient, quickly moved her to her little cubicle where she could get dressed in her gown. But she felt like she didn't matter to anyone, like she was a widget on an assembly line. And she was all into the quality and safety stuff. And she said they were doing all the procedures perfectly. She had to pee. And she, in her little gown, gets herself out of her cubicle across the room to the bathroom. To her horror, when she's walking out holding her patient gown behind her, she sees the gastroenterologist sitting in the chair in her cubicle. And she carefully walks across, and she said as she got to her bed, he did 3 things. He did battle with the curtains, trying to ensure some virtual privacy. As she sat down, he pulled the sheet up over her knees, respecting her modesty. And then he looked at her on eye level and he said, this isn't going so well for you, is it? And she said, with those 3 simple acts, he affirmed her humanity and her concerns. And she said he was the only one who communicated that who she was matters. Now, why I love that example is because he didn't do anything dramatic. He was with her a very short time, but he inspired great confidence in her commitment, in his commitment to her well-being, and made her feel safe. So she called the article Secret Shopper because she'd been very careful not to let anyone know that she was a physician, and then she ended up with this beautiful piece in JAMA. Now, I want to quickly share two narratives. On the left, Dr. John Collins Harvey is a physician, general practitioner, geriatrician, now retired, spent the bulk of his professional practice at Johns Hopkins and at Georgetown. After he retired, for years, previous patients called him for advice. We'd hear him in his office because he's an ethicist, and he worked with us in the Center for Healthcare Ethics. If you had the Marcus Welby, if you're old enough to remember, the classic physician. In good health until he had a heart event, and he was hospitalized at Georgetown. So when he came back to our practice, I said, John, what was that experience like, being a patient, post-MI, with some complications? And very sensitive, I'm a nurse, to the doctor-nurse conflicts. John says to me, Carol, the nurses today are like the medical residents in my day. He said, they hung the meds, they titrated them, they read the strips, and then there was the pregnant butt. And I'm like, okay, what's going to follow this? That was the compliment. He said, I had dentures, and it was 3 days before anyone offered me help with my dentures and did oral care. He said, I'm enough of a dinosaur that I remember PM care when patients got back rubs. And he said, I was really anxious. I would have loved a little bit of that TLC. And then he said, this was my first brush with mortality. And no one talked with me about my fears. And he wasn't suggesting that nurses should go back to being handholders who only worried about oral care and gave back rubs. But he was saying, had we achieved our higher measures of success, if you would, at the expense of something that was central to the patient experience. Sister Lillian, I was a Catholic sister for 35 years before I met the wonderful man sitting back there, was my first college president. She was a marvelous human being. At the age of 39, she was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer, and then spent 2 of the hardest years of dying that I've ever witnessed. When she died, she was like a Holocaust victim. She had intestinal obstruction. She was in and out of the hospital. And she said to me, close to her dying and death, Carol, please tell your students. I was teaching nursing at our college at the time. She said, when I first got sick, it didn't matter how people treated me because I knew who I was. President of the college, PhD in microbiology. She was from Worcester, Mass, and had all that New England privacy and reserve that got trampled on. She was one of the most gentle, loving human beings that I've had the good fortune to know. She said, as I've grown weaker, I become whatever someone makes of me. And she said, if a nurse walks into my room and moves me like meat, I become meat. And I wanted to cry that I, or a member of my profession, had the capacity to take a Lillian and transform her to a slab of meat on a platter by virtue of my approach. By virtue of my approach. So when I said we give 1 of 3 messages in each clinical encounter, we go through the day receiving those messages. So Sheila, God love her, described me as a marvelous human being, and I'm feeling quite good. Somebody else, I might get your evaluations, and they say, what a bust. Why did you bring Carol to Portland? And I'm going to say, what do they know in Portland? They love me in DC. I have multiple sources from which to derive my sense of worth. Put me flat on my back in a bed, a nursing home, on your unit, you become my world of meaning. You have the capacity to take a Lillian and transform her to a slab of meat by virtue of the approach you choose. So this is my question. Do we not see literature on humane care of humans because it's safe to assume that everybody's getting that? We had a lively discussion at lunch about how we're going to care for elders and vulnerable populations moving forward in this country, with scarce resources in terms of both family and paid caregivers, and scarce finances to resource some of that. So these were some of my opening questions. If you look at the third, should humane care be something for VIP people? Is it like a better carpet in your room, or nice drapes, or better quality food? Or is it absolutely essential for everyone? And who's ensuring that that's indeed what patients receive? Back in the 1980s, Dr. Arnold Relman, who was New England Journal of Medicine editor, coined this term medical industrial complex, right? It's all about the business of healthcare today. And healthcare is a business, right? Providence merges with Swedish. Look how big you are, how many states you're working in. And we need, in these days of the Affordable Care Act, and God only knows how that's going to affect all of us moving forward, to generate the revenues that'll keep the lights on and the doors open. So we are a business, but can we ever be only a business, is the question. I'm seeing, one morning driving into work, NPR on the radio use the example of a NASCAR pit stop to illustrate what encounters in healthcare should be. Saying if we really were lean, mean machines, the healthcare team, when I come into the ER, would emerge like the pit crew, check my tire pressure, check my oil, get me running, and out again. Now, is that the type of healthcare that we want? When I use this example in Beirut, a physician came up to me afterwards, one of the medical faculty, and he said, whereas every machine might be the same, and that pit car analogy works for a car, no two humans are the same. So you can't have that. We saw that. Do you remember the algorithms when we first started DRGs, and we had those critical maps and care maps, and if you had this condition in 2 days you should be here, and it was great if you were that statistical person who was perfect. If you were the outlier, something was wrong with you, not wrong with the care map. So you weren't where you needed to be. So I'm not saying these analogies aren't helpful. There's something to be learned about how we could all do our jobs better, but they can never represent the whole of healthcare. The Picker and the Plane Tree institutes have really been fundamental in popularizing this notion. I love it. It's a new thing on the block, person-centered care, and you want to say, what did it ever become? That person-centered care is the new kid on the block. Who were we treating before that? But this is what they're saying should distinguish all of us. And I love, it's just their illustration. They said in the old days, when they first 30 years ago talked about person-centered care, everybody thought it would gum up the works. It wasn't workable. And that was when, as providers, we were the experts, right? The patients were what needed to be fixed. Families were visitors. We ran the show. Don't try to tell me what you need, all right? So it's critical, if that's actually the approach that we want, how do we bring about the changes that really make patients and families partners, that keeps us focused on quality of life care, that treats patients as more than problems to be fixed. Now, this is my sweet husband, who is a physician ethicist, who always talks about the 5 Ps. And he said, if you look at any human enterprise, but certainly healthcare, the drivers seem to be power, position, prestige, profit and politics now that we live in Washington, D.C. All right? I have a breast cancer researcher colleague from MD Anderson. He said, when we meet a new patient, the objective is to sign them up for as many research protocols as we can. The patient has become the vehicle to deliver the science so that we will meet our research goals, retain and secure new funding. That's not healthcare. That's the Faustian bargain, strikingly absent from those 5 Ps. The patient, people, the public, and God forbid, the poor. Which is why you ought to be patting yourselves on the back here at Providence with the mission statement that you have. Last week I was doing a class for our CPE residents, and we had a Jesuit priest from Vienna. And we have a dear friend in Vienna, and I said, you know, by any chance, do you know Jürgen Wallner? He works at the St. John of God Hospital. And this priest, who was from a different, he said, what a place. Anyone who comes into that hospital is treated superbly. Doesn't matter if they have insurance. Everyone gets excellent care. Wouldn't it be nice if that could be said and be true of every place in the United States? So frequently, it is about changing our lens. And this is where leadership is so important. My dad, we always had this rivalry about whether he got better grades or I got better grades and who was more successful academically. And if I got summa cum and he had magna cum, he said, well, Carol, that's because you don't have a family and any other responsibilities. You can devote yourself full-time to your studies. But he said, you succeed, Carol, because you pay attention to what people want and you deliver it. Now, that's not bad advice if you want to be successful, but it underscores the importance of what leadership pays attention to. So if you report to me, what do you have to do to be successful? And so the messages that we give in leadership are absolutely critical. So I love this notion that it's people and human flourishing that matter. And that's our first lens. Our people, I always say, at the end of the day, our probably most pressing ethical question ought to be, are people better or worse because they got me? Are they better or worse because they got my surgical team? Are they better or worse because they got Providence and not Emmanuel or anything else? So are we delivering the goods? I know how many have heard Verghese TED Talk. This is the amazing, I think he's an oncologist from Stanford, who wrote that book, Cutting for Stone. If you love fiction, this guy is marvelous. But in his TED Talk, he talks about the importance of the human hand and how that matters in diagnostics. And he said the next 10 years, the most important tool is going to be the human hand. But then look at this next statement. He said, this is blasphemy coming from Silicon Valley. But he said, I think the patient in the bed has become the icon for the real patient who's in the computer. And he said, I've coined a term. I think that patient should be called the I patient. It's the one that's getting all of our attention while the patient in the bed waits for somebody to come and explain what's going on. What's our lens? How can I fix you? What's wrong with you? How can I help you to live life fully? This was a student of mine in ethics, vulnerability. And she said, I always heard about vulnerability. And I sort of understood that it mattered, but it wasn't till I became ill that I really got it. How it feels to be debilitated and passive. How it affects our ability to take in information, to ask questions, to make informed decisions. When that vulnerability is not recognized, when physicians, professionals treat patients as consumers of a service, then they're, instead of persons needing a trusting and caring relationships, then they're kind of excused. We let ourselves off the hook. And she said, it's not until you're in that own position of vulnerability that you get why this matters. Now, I don't want to make every medical student, every nursing student, or other health professional suffer a chronic or serious illness in order to get it. Is that the only way we can learn why the quality of our interactions matter? I used to do a simulation when I taught geriatric classes, and I would bring the students in the morning and I'd tell them to show for pre-conference at 8 o'clock, and we'd put the old men's shirts splattered with food stains, and we put their hands in rubber gloves twisted. We'd put unpopped popcorn kernels in their shoes, and we gave them glasses with Vaseline circles on them, and then we'd have them do daily tasks and struggle. But when they'd show up at 8 o'clock, I would scream at them. And I'd say one by one as they came in, you were supposed to be here at 7:30. If you think you can get off on the right foot with this rotation by showing up a half hour late, shame on you. To a person, they would go in and sit down. Nobody ever contradicted me. And at the end of the day, when we would process the simulation, and we'd talk about the popcorn and the glasses and all this, I'd say, so what time were you supposed to be here this morning? And some brave soul would say, well, we were supposed to be here for 8 o'clock. And I said, well, when I screamed at you this morning for showing up at 7:30, why didn't you correct me? And they said, because you're the teacher and we're the student. I said, in long-term care, the residents feel like they're the lowest person on the totem pole. I wanted you to appreciate that power differential. And I can't tell you how often residents would complain to me and then say, please don't say anything to the nurses. Because they were afraid when I and the students were gone that there would be reprisals. Think of that as the youngest, greenest nursing student, they had more power than a 92-year-old cognitively intact woman. Now, we live in a consumer-driven society, and we've given a lot more power to patients, residents, and their families. There's still a huge power differential. Have you seen this film? If you haven't, I would say, if you just Google empathy video, this was done at the Cleveland Clinic. And it's a short video, and they have this camera that goes through the clinic, and you just meet people. But then there's a one-liner. And, you see this couple, and the guy's bringing the wife coffee, and then you get the line that their son is on life support. And you meet somebody else, and they've just gotten good news about biopsy results. And it's just designed to say, if we really knew what was going on with the people that we encounter every day, would our responses be different? How many of you are sitting here without a worry in the world, plaguing your mind, your thinking, your heart? And we don't wear that on our sleeve. And let me tell you how bad my life is. I was just in the bathroom, and some little kid was crying, and the mom is saying to him, what a hard life you have. What a hard life you have. And it's not about spilling our guts to everybody about how difficult it is to live with my sweet husband back there and his 5 Ps. I think I saw a tongue come out. But if we knew, think of what families of the chronically and seriously ill are going through. I was at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia recently, and they have one of those, you take your parking ticket and you pay it in the machine so that's what you use to go out. There's no human cashier. And as I'm walking through I heard 3 people yell at the machine that they obviously didn't have the ticket, or they didn't have and I went into the people that were hosting me, and I got into the lobby, and I'm like, what is going on? And she said, Carol, our families are so stressed out. And when they come in, they dump on staff, and we give it right back. We give it right back. I've had complaints about our PICU that the young nurses develop these adversarial relationships with the parents of sick children because they find them too demanding. And they said at this point in their life, they can't begin to imagine what it's like to be the parent of a seriously ill child. So compassion is a special type of animal. It's not just about feeling somebody's pain. It's about being moved within the context of your role, responsibility, and resources to move that individual to a better place. So empathy is about feeling pain. Compassion is about marshaling our resources. I love this. This was Joan Halifax, also a great TED Talk. Buddha was asked by Ananda, would it be true to say the cultivation of loving kindness and compassion is part of our practice? And the answer, if you're dealing with people, it's the whole of our practice because of our power to influence one another's well-being. Because the intimate nature of so much of what we do, if we do it in a way that objectifies people or worse, bad things can happen. And I'm just thinking, we had our, last time we had our air conditioning heating guy in, young Hispanic male, and it was after Easter. And I said to him, you know, what did you and your wife do over the holiday? As he's looking at our air conditioning unit. And he goes, oh, he said, Saturday we were watching a movie with our 2-year-old son, and we popped some popcorn. And he said, I went to the bathroom, my wife went to get drinks, and the son got an unpopped kernel, pushed it up his nose. We couldn't get it out. We head to the emergency room. He said the nurse was so, how could good parents allow this to happen? His concern now was his wife was going to be so overprotective because of the way the emergency room nurse made her feel, that he said, I'm going to be the dad of a sissy, a mama's boy, because she's not going to let one interaction. Wouldn't you like to find that nurse and say, do you know what you did? Probably well-intentioned. Well-intentioned, but with a really bad result. So this is the balanced life type thing. How do we become these compassionate healers? And I love this phrase from Proverbs, a happy heart is like good medicine, a broken spirit drains your strength. It dries your bones. So if you could, this was a Bruce Feldstein, a physician that I met at a spiritual care institute in DC. He was an ER doc who had a crippling back injury, became a Jewish chaplain, and he wrote this marvelous piece that I think is in your resource. He said, I now appreciate the most important thing I bring to each bedside encounter is myself, and how my presence comforts and heals. How many of us would be able to say that? And he has, I'm not going to read through this lovely exercise. Because you have to wash your hands or gel them before each clinical encounter, he uses that ritual to ground himself. So it's what makes him be in the present moment. And he said, my prayer is that as I wash my hands or gel them, my preoccupations evaporate, and I'm open to who the patient needs me to be. It's a lovely example. When I enter the room, I take another full breath to keep my focus. I knock. I touch the patient first with my eyes, then with my voice, then with my hands if appropriate. Encourage you to read that. I've given you, or we've given you, Providence has given you, this care index as something to take back to your teams. It's a lovely self-care, care for others. How would you describe yourself? Compassion fatigued, burned out, or energized to heal? How many people would say, boy, on a 1 to 7 scale, 7 being most, I'm most energized to heal? There's some hands, but they're few and far between. How many see us more in the 3, 4, compassion fatigued, burned out? More hands went up with that, and maybe some of us hopefully are between there and the 7. Powerful questions. also to ask about the team that you work with. And what the CARE Index does, it goes into some foundational beliefs about care for self, care for others. If you've got a difficult coworker, how do you try to understand them? I love Vicki Lackman, a colleague, psych mental health nurse ethicist. She said, all human behavior is understandable if we understood it. Like a Carmelite priest that I used to know, he said, Carol, your problem is you expect people to be normal. My sense of what's normal. And when they confound my expectations, they make me unhappy. I'm like, get with the program. Why are you so slow? If you understood who people are, where they are, we'd be in a very different place. So there's actually a compassion fatigue awareness project. They have all sorts of studies, but it's really, they're describing it now, and I think there's an error. That should read PTSD. I just saw that this morning. But it's like post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not my stress, it's somebody else's stress. So I'm involved on a daily basis with people who are in these overwhelming situations, and there's a point at which we take on their suffering. The meaning of compassion is to bear suffering in our effort to view the world from the perspective of the suffering we suffer. Now, I say yes and no to that, because sometimes it's walking with people who are suffering that gives meaning to my life. It is what gets me up, what energizes me, what brings me in. But if you're in that place for a long time, it can become overwhelming. Burnout is where the transition happens. And when I'm burned out, I move from this positive place of wanting to help to beginning to feel indifferent. So the only way I can keep showing up is to shut down my caring. So if it hurts too much to walk into my work environment and to be 100% there, and I need to stay in this job or stay in this position, one way to cope. But look at some of the causes. What is my role? Unrealistic expectations, they can be from me. Do I have to be the savior who saves everybody? It may be unrealistic expectation on the parts of my team, my supervisor, the patients or the families that I serve, lack of control, unreasonable demands. So a lot can contribute to that. How charged are we? Another way, if you look at your iPad or your iPhone every morning, but how many of us, and this is the balanced life question, would say that we're fully charged and brimming with vim, vigor, and vitality? Sometimes it takes hard choices to pay enough attention to ourselves to make the changes. I can remember after a similar talk, this older nurse coming to me, and she said, every holiday, my whole family comes and I make this great meal. And she said, then I'm so tired that I have no time to interact with my children and grandchildren. And she said, you've made me rethink that. Maybe we should order pizza next time and talk. So sometimes there are these things that we do that are well-intended, well-motivated, but they end up not being life-giving to us. So this is just an opportunity at noon to step back from our lives to say, are our priorities in the right place? And are the time that we're giving to things reinforcing those priorities? This is a very helpful exercise, and I first did this in Victoria in spring when everything was blossoming. And I invited people to think about the type of plant that illustrates where you are at this point in your life. Now, for people with strong imaginative abilities, this exercise might resonate. But there was somebody who said after lunch, there's this little brushy type thing that everybody walks on. And that was the plant she thought illustrated where she was. More recently, this hospice nurse's aide, she said, I just lost my mother and I was grieving. And she said, they told me to go out to Oak Creek Canyon and find one of these big old pines. And she said, I literally hugged this pine and I sniffed in that evergreen. And she said there was something cleansing and healing about it, as well as the strength of the pine. And she said, that's who I want to be to her. And she was this little Latina woman. I said to her, Maria, I said, I could just see me hugging you and sniffing you up and walking away with, new energy to be who I needed to be. At the same meeting, another nursing aide said, I have this arbor vitae on my property. He said, the south side gets the sun and it's lush. The north side is kind of brown, pretty barren. And he said, when I'm at work, I'm like the south side. And he was known for being a great aide. He said, I'm 100% there for my patients and families. He said, my personal life is so impoverished. I don't have family, friends. He was living alone. He's not making a lot of money. He said, I know I'm out of balance. I'm out of balance, and I can't keep being who I need to be at work unless I begin to take care of my private life. Okay, Marty Maniti was, and I'm going to wrap this up in about 10 minutes, was a wonderful critical care nurse. And she encouraged a group of us. We were Catholic sisters, many in healthcare, but not all. And she did this visualization where she said, and if we had more time, I'd invite you to take the cleansing breaths and close your eyes, to think about what you were like the first day you showed up for practice. So first day as a surgeon, a chaplain, a social worker, a nurse. She had us, what did we look like? What were we thinking? What were we feeling? So sunrise, new day. And after she steeped us in that, she fast forwarded to today. So for many of us, that could be a sunrise. And it was pretty humorous when she said, what were you thinking when you first started practice? What are you thinking today? But when she said, what did you look like then? What do you look like now? A lot of us laughed. But the question is, are we still who we need to be? Has time changed us in positive ways? Have we learned things that make us more present to the people we serve? Or has it deadened us? One cancer patient after a while begins to look like another. I used to cry with new births, but now one new birth is like another new birth. And it's just get the job done. And this might be particularly apt here, but this is a gray sky. You had the beautiful sunrise. Are we stormy weather or just another gray day? What do people get when they get me? Do they get that I'm alive, I'm present, I'm interested in who they are? Brene Brown, if you haven't seen her TED Talk, has some marvelous stuff on vulnerability and on shame. She has a TED Talk on shame. But she talks about, as a social worker, researcher, what matters is our connectedness. And as she did her research, she got people who she describes as living wholeheartedly. And then she got other people that were kind of just dragging their ass around every day, trying to get through a day. And offers, I think, some really helpful insights into the difference. So those of you this morning, when I talked about healing presence, it was this condition of standing in front of the other, affirming the wholeness of them, affirming their possibilities for growth, even in the midst of really, really hard times. I'm going to leave these slides, because I talked about them a little bit this morning, and get to this. So if we think about our own self-care, and we're intent upon being this healing presence, do we hold beliefs that meet our own universal spiritual needs? So when you say, why is it that this young couple who look like such loving parents have had 3 miscarriages, and now they've birthed a micro preemie that may make it or not? Why does that happen? How do you show up every day? Do we derive from these beliefs strength for everyday living, especially when we confront pain, suffering, and death? Do we set aside regular time to nurture ourselves? Bob and I were at a home in Manhattan for medically fragile children. Amazing caregivers, amazing facilities. And I said to some of these, mostly LPNs, women my age, who did back-breaking labor every day with these kids whose care needs overwhelmed their families. And this one woman, a nursing aide, said to me, and she took care of an extended family at home. She was raising her daughter's children. She said, the only time I'm alone is when I lock myself into the bathroom. And she said, I take my Bible and my bills into the bathroom. And she said, now my granddaughter learned how to pick the lock. And we laugh, and at the same time, my heart breaks. She doesn't have the luxury of downtime to unwind. She cares for kids 8-9 hours a day, goes home and cares for kids, wakes up in the morning, cares for kids. Look at the top. Do I demonstrate in my interaction? If the people who knew you were asked, what do you get when you get me? Would they say, I get peace, inner strength, warmth, caring? Do they say, I get a cold fish? I get a ball of tension? What do they get? Demonstrate sensitivity, develop sexual strategy. So think about the life you're living, and is it preparing each of us to be that compassionate healer that Providence and our professions call us to be? Is there something that needs to change? And sometimes those changes are painful. To what degree would recent recipients of your care, my care, experience us as healing presences? I love the film test. If we had captured each of us, unbeknownst to us, on film for the last week that you practiced, and it was playing in the lobby when you came in today, would you say, I hope they didn't capture Tuesday? Or somebody said to me, I hope there's not a soundtrack running with this. Or would you throw your shoulders back and say, by God, Providence finally knows who they have. I hope they're showing this in every facility. I'm a role model. What kind of person do we each need to be? Again, if I would ask you to think about somebody who comes to mind if I say healing presence, and what is it about that person? For me, we had a chaplain, Sister Jean Bridgman, who died of a glioblastoma in her 50s. She was this amazing woman, but she was this wise soul, grounded, gentle. She served our perinatal area. She could walk into conflict and it would escalate down. Now, I'm more like a bull in a china shop. I'm never going to be Sister Jean Bridgman, but how do I do healing presence? That's the question for each of us, because we are all uniquely different. So how do you become that? When I'm exhausted and running on empty, how do we renew our spirits? A glass of wine? A bottle of wine? Nature? I love water. A pond is good, an ocean is better. But it renews me, like there's something bigger than I am. In what ways might our lifestyles need to change? Part of my being married was part of my answer at a point in my life when my life needed to change in order to be the person that I valued being. And there are times there are really hard choices that need to be made in order for us to be true. What kind of institutional culture or ethos promotes that? Now, there's a second set of questions for corporate reflection. Are patients' families, are we as staff better, more whole at the end of the day as a result of our being in this culture? What elements in our culture support this wholehearted living? Remind us who we're called to be. What should we celebrate here? And what needs to change? Who's responsible for this? Certainly mission leaders. Certainly pastoral care plays a role. But anybody at any level of leadership, and there's ground. Budgets reveal corporate values. You're fortunate here. And that Providence is a place that values mission, it values pastoral services. You're in a much better, but how is that being used? I want to end with this. Denise Thornby was president of the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. Again, I'm a nurse. This is our largest professional organization. When she was president, she titled her monthly newsletter, Make Waves. It was about, if the culture's not working, you got to change it. And she called on seasoned, experienced people to mentor younger folks in doing that. Her obituary in August contained this quote that she was famous for saying, every day, and she's quoting John Quincy Adams, we influence others. And she's saying, that's going to be our immortality. The way we've affected others. So she's asking us, and she said, courage comes from the French word cœur. It's a matter of the heart. So part of, I think, the question that I want to put before us today is, what act of courage are we being called to in order to make compassionate healing what everyone receives? And sometimes it's self-transformation, sometimes it's working collaboratively with your team. Something is, what will be your act of courage? How will you influence it? What will be your legacy? So this was Denise's legacy. If we could each put our picture there, what do we want our legacy to be? Now, I don't know how clear this is. I'm really close. This is a huge oak, like 3 stories high, that was in our front yard. Hurricane Sandy was predicted, high winds in the DC area. I suggested to my sweet husband that he should move his car. His Audi was in the driveway. I later heard a huge thud, and one of the big oaks in our front yard fell down, missed his Audi by about that much. Did not miss our roof. I went out at that point and moved the Audi. Within 30 minutes, the second oak fell right where his car had been. Had it fallen a few minutes earlier, I wouldn't be standing here now. I would be nicely, thank you, nicely compacted in his Audi, which he had not moved. And then the question of what my legacy would be more than theoretical. None of us know if we're going to have tomorrow. If we didn't wake up tomorrow, what would people say about us? Goodbye, good riddance. The world's a better place without Carol. Or would they say, what a loss? What a loss. So I invite us to think about the call we each have to be compassionate healers, to a little bit of reflection where we are on the spectrum of our ability to do that, and perhaps how our lifestyles need to change in order to do it better ourselves and with one another. Thank you. And if anybody needs to leave, right, they're certainly free to do that. And if you've got comments, questions, challenges, we'd be delighted to hear them. Please. And she's going to bring a mic to you because it's available, I think, in other. Hold on, please.
Not at this facility, but another Providence facility. And recently I've had nurses come to me and say, I'm so burnt out. This is my 5th day in a row, 12-hour shift, no breaks, and that's more and more like healthcare today.
Right.
So how can people renew or not kind of get burnout?
Okay, so realities of today's practice, 5 12-hour shifts in a row, how do we not get burned out? This is I think, paying attention and being intentional about it. I would want a unit conversation. One, is that the only staffing pattern? Is there a better way to do that? If this is like a limited time till we can hire and get our numbers up, how are we going to support one another in the process? And then, I'm the old days. I worked 8-hour shifts, not 12-hour shifts. Somehow in that 12 hours, we've got to carve out time. And people talk about, whatever it is, that sometimes I don't need an hour to sleep, but I need 10 minutes to sit down and put my feet up and take some deep cleansing breaths. And those are self-care behaviors that we can help one another with. What I don't like is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's Chicken Little, the sky is falling, it's bad and it's going to get worse, and we don't see a way out of it. So I think sometimes naming it, and that's that hard question, what needs to change? At that home for medically fragile children, whenever there was a death, the pastoral care would have cookies and coffee, a cart, sent to the unit, and the message was, it's okay to stop and to talk about this child. Now, I compare that with a critical care nurse who said to me, we've involved sometimes for weeks, months, in the care of a patient. That patient dies, I've immediately got somebody else coming in, and there's a bed and a room to clean, and there's rapid turnover. Something's wrong with that picture. So that's why I say, what's our lens? I'm not saying efficiencies don't matter. I'm not saying we don't live in a world that's lean and mean, and I have spoken up at board meetings where senior leadership would extol, and they've got measures for these, that they've extracted every ounce of productivity out of us, and this is what we're paying for it, and aren't we doing a good job? And I'm jumping up saying, how do we know that we haven't extracted too much? So if burnout and fatigue is a problem, it needs our best minds. And as somebody said at lunch, right, a problem can make us despair and depressed, or it can invite our creative thinking. But there's got to be time and space for that creative thinking. But that's what I meant when I said you can accept the conditions and live with them to everybody's detriment. Or we can think about creative ways to bring about. There isn't a magic wand about this. We were talking about magic wand. Maybe there is, and we need to find it. But it's the right question to ask. In a room, like in a place like this, when I say how many of us come to work full of vim vigor, there weren't a lot of hands that come up. So that says something.
And then we don't have a lot of power. The staff nurses, the social workers, we are people with no power.
Okay, so comment, we don't have a lot of power, and yet this is a magnet facility, right? Are you here?
I'm not here.
Okay, all right. I mean, in a magnet facility, there's supposed to be power.
Right. But I've worked in a magnet facility.
Right, and it's not necessarily so. Right.
Social workers were answering their phones all through lunch, never get a break. If you're in the restroom, they'll overhead page you. So you can't even pee in peace.
No, I hear you. I hear you. So how do we get the power to bring about meaningful change? And in the meantime, think creatively with our colleagues. Because you've got to think about, and that's a question for senior leadership. If we come in dragging, if it's another stormy day or a gray sky, and because it's all about patient satisfaction, it's not going to happen.
Absolutely, but I think it's our personal lives that suffer, because most of us come on. I rarely see a nurse mistreating a patient.
Right. That's the Arbor Vitae story, but you can't keep that up. You can neglect your personal family and personal life for so long. Bob.
Every once in a while, Carol lets me say something. What I would like everyone here to do is take hands with who's ever on either side of you. Everybody.
He's a touchy-feely guy.
Hey, if we can do it, you all can do it. Carol talked about who you are and about institutional culture and so on. But you all work with other people, and they have some of the same experiences you do. And the culture, not just in the institution and not how you feel about things, but how your teammates do, how the other people that you're working with, and I don't just mean the other professionals, everyone else, and what kind of culture develops on the unit can be reinforced by reaching out to your colleagues. And I think that's the one thing that I would add to what Carol said. Thank you.
Good, good. Comment up front here.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and I do work here in the emergency room, and I can very much relate to what she's talking about. So I work directly with a nurse practitioner most of the day, and now it's gotten to the point because of our numbers that we only have one nurse practitioner who sees all the patients for about a 15-hour shift with no breaks. And that kind of sets the tone for everyone in the area. Mm-hmm. Because, so even though we talk to each other, mm-hmm. it's so high up the...
Now, is that a choice that somebody chooses to work a 15 hours, or that's the way the job is scheduled?
That's the way the job is expected.
Okay.
You're right ready to leave your 12-hour shift, and social workers, at least I'm salary. Mm-hmm. So after it's over, we get no money.
Right. No, I get that. I mean, the only thing I can say there...
Dictate after
right.
the 12-hour shift.
Right.
They're there sometimes.
There's actually questions right now about dictating and documentation and whether or not that needs to be done in the 12-hour period or not be done. And obviously it not being done isn't an option, but then that data needs to come to senior leadership to say this is unsustainable as a daily practice. And I hear you say, and then I know I'm going to say for nurses, we actually have something in our code right now that says you try to change an unhealthy work environment or an unsafe work environment. If you can't, you should leave, because otherwise you're allowing an immoral situation to continue. Now, you're appropriately asking, is there another place that's better right now?
I doubt it.
So, I wish I had the answer. I wish, but, and part of why I'm doing what I'm doing, I'm not naive. I know what those realities are, and I know what the pressures are to work harder and faster, leaner and meaner. I don't want this side to not get equal voice and equal attention. And so I'm going to die saying we can't capitulate to those forces, because those are dark forces. And I have to derive my peace from the hope that somebody more creative, visionary, brighter than me is going to figure out. So sometimes I think there are things that we can each do, and the choices that we make every day. This is a huge structural change that needs to take place. And I say to my students all the time, you've got to figure this problem out, because it's going to kill us. We become automatons. We don't help anybody. There's a comment up in them. Here comes the answer.
I'm a nurse case manager in a Providence primary care clinic. And recently with the Medicare changes to hospice and their criteria,
Right.
I'm having a lot of my patients greater than 90 turned down for hospice. And the frustration with the healthcare law, I mean, where do you go with all the regulations? How can you, I have a hard time dealing with it. I have providers that are in tears.
Right.
And I don't know what to tell them.
Okay, I spoke to that a little bit this morning. A huge difference, first of all, between for-profit and not-for-profit hospice. There's no question that there have been abuses of hospice benefits. And I know work with some really good ones who, because of the increased scrutiny, are looking at their admissions. There have been programs who've signed people up that weren't hospice eligible and fudged the data entry so that they could get reimbursed. Trying to fix that problem by making those benefits ineligible by people who need it, who can't get it, is not going to solve that problem. And part of what we were discussing this morning and at lunch were the new systems of care that need to be developed to meet these needs for people who aren't really expected to die within the next 6 months, but need a bundle of services that aren't available elsewhere. And I don't know how we're going to fix those problems, but there's no question that the regulations right now are not adequately meeting the needs of those who need care. And it's the 99% of the US, but it's not the 1% who can buy whatever service they want. It's this big group in the middle, not to mention the most vulnerable poor. And I would think that's a particular challenge here with your mission saying you take care of the most vulnerable. How do you do that if the resources aren't there? And all I can say is we want people with a foot in both camps. So if you stop caring about the people that are being denied, then we're in a really bad place if we make our peace with this world.
We need to give that speech to administration.
I know that.
I will tell you, all of us here are giving 200%. Okay, we are at our wit's end, and I am a strong woman, and I don't let anything get me down, but I think that this mission is threatened, and I never thought I would say that. I mean, tremendous sacrifice, professionally and also financially to work for profits because I believe in the mission. And what they're doing now, I mean, this is a ethical crisis for me. I am not easily cowed by challenge ever.
Right.
So this needs to, the administration needs to hear this because we are already giving 200%.
Okay. And we don't have a mic there. For those of you listening from afar, the comment is everybody here in this room is already giving 200%. Senior leadership needs to hear this message and a conviction that the mission is already in jeopardy. And this is an ethical matter. And I think there might be a way to get that message back. Jack Glazer always talked about the 3 realms of ethics: ethics at the level of the individual, the institution, and society. And he was known for saying, here in the United States, with the way we've linked until now insurance with employment and have accepted the whatever number you want to use, 42 million, 48 million, who lack insurance and who lack decent access, he said, in the United States, it's almost impossible for institutions to be moral, to deliver good care, because of the way we finance it. And if at the institution level, we don't allow individuals to practice the way you've sacrificed in order to be able to practice. So it's the whole series of interrelationships until we decide. We figure out, and it's not a US problem now, it's a global problem. Which services everybody ought to be able to get, and how do we finance them in an equitable way? I'm sympathetic to leadership trying to keep afloat in the current environment, but how we do that, I think it's very different if you've got investors in a for-profit company taking big dividends while we don't have adequate staff and people are being denied care. But these are the hard choices. I think we are having these conversations with senior leadership. But you're absolutely right to signal how we talk about just cultures where we treat one another fairly. We're certainly not a country that is known for doing that well. And we're living in a country right now where not only income inequality, but equality in terms of access to services and resources are becoming more and more disparate. So what I was talking about here was changes sometimes at the personal level or at the team level. We have some huge societal changes that need to take place, and that begins with our attitudes and our convictions about whether or not we're our brother and sister's keeper. So I think, because these questions are getting harder and I have no idea how to answer them, I'm going to say, let's go home. Thank you very, very much. And I think we need to find hope in our current reality and figure a way to dig out of this and to help one another in the process. And world peace.
Dr. Taylor, thank you for your words of wisdom, insight. Center at the medical grounds at age. She'll be talking about she'll use a case study to help us take a look at the ethical complexities of giving it more time and making hard decisions around that. So I hope to see you there. Bye now.
Thank you.